Or is it recording now? Okay. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم سبحانك اللهم لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم وعنده مفاتح الغيب لا يعلمها إلا هو ويعلم ما في البر والبحر وما تسقط من ورقة إلا يعلمها ولا حبة في ظلمات الأرض ولا رطب ولا يابس إلا في كتاب مبين. So we arrive towards the end of the presentation of the Sirah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So today's lecture will be the final lecture, and it will discuss the final events of the Prophet's life alayhi salatu wasalam. And also, we want to end with talking about what do we do with all of this information, all of these stories, all of these details. What do we do with that? How do we take that and act upon it? How do we take that? How does it improve our Islam, etc.? So the story begins with the final events of the 10th year of the Hijrah. We had talked about the Hajj and the return from Hajj and all of that. One of the things that we didn't mention is that in the last Ramadan of the Prophet ﷺ, which was that Ramadan prior to that Hajj, is that he made i'tikaf for 20 days. Although his habit, his sunnah was to make i'tikaf for 10 days. So the sunnah i'tikaf is 10 days, but this last year, the Prophet ﷺ made i'tikaf, made the seclusion in the month of Ramadan for 20 days, and he reviewed the Quran in its entirety with Gabriel twice. So every year the Prophet ﷺ would review the Quran once with Gabriel, but in this year, the final year, the Prophet ﷺ reviewed the entire Quran twice. And the Prophet ﷺ, he made some statements that alluded to that this is the end of his earthly life during the Hajj. So for example, he said, I don't know if I will see you after this year. I don't know if we will meet again after this year. So there were some indications that this was the end, or towards the end, the Prophet ﷺ was nearing the end of his mission. So when the Prophet ﷺ returns to Medina, and the year 10 turns into the year 11, in the beginning of Safar, which is the second month of the Islamic calendar, Safar al-Khayr, as we refer to it, the Prophet ﷺ, he went out to Uhud, and he visited the graves of the martyrs of Uhud, and he prayed for those that had died in the battle of Uhud. The Prophet ﷺ also visited Baqiyah, and at the end of the month, on the 28th or the 29th of the month of Safar, and in this year, Safar was 30 days, so a few days before the end of the month, it was, and he had returned from a janazah prayer in the Baqiyah. And if you've ever been to Medina, the Baqiyah is not too far away from the mosque of the Prophet, where the Prophet ﷺ is buried, and we'll get to that in a minute. That was actually his home. So the Baqiyah, we're not talking about too far of a distance, but by the time the Prophet ﷺ was returning from the Baqiyah to his house, he had a massive, massive headache. And this began the sickness, his final sickness. The total sickness lasted about 13, 14 days. So about 2 weeks, the Prophet ﷺ was sick, and he led the prayer for 11 of those days. So it was really only the last few days in which the Prophet ﷺ was unable to lead the community in prayer, and Sayyidina Abu Bakr, he led the people in prayer. We'll get to that as well. But that sort of gives you a sense of we're really only talking about these last 2 weeks. As he felt that he was getting sick, he took permission from his wives that he remain in the house of Sayyidah Aisha alayhi salam. And this is ultimately where the Prophet ﷺ passed away. So his habit was that he would allot equal amount of time for each wife, and all of them lived next to each other. And he was too sick to stand, the headache, the fever, it was being very heavy. And when you read in the details of these type of attributes of the Prophet ﷺ, his sickness was more intense than our sickness. Some of the Sahaba would say he was so hot that we couldn't even touch his head or his skin because it would singe us. So his fever was severe. His sickness was severe, alayhi salatu wasalam. So he took permission to remain in Lady Aisha's house, and then she began reciting Quran for him, Ikhlas and Falaq and Nas, wiping his forehead and his face with water, trying to cool him. I mean, they're not sure if this is, he knows, alayhi salatu wasalam, that this is the end, but they're not sure. They're trying, as we normally would with anyone that was sick. In the last 5 days, there was an incident in which the Prophet ﷺ, he takes essentially a bath, and his fever is quieted a little bit, and he goes out to the companions and he gives them a warning. He says, Allah Ta'ala has cursed the people before us because they have taken the graves of their prophets as places of prostration. لعن الله اليهود والنصارى اتخذوا قبور أنبيائهم مساجد. And this hadith is very important because the Prophet ﷺ is now laying down some instructions of what is going to happen when he passes. And this hadith is also very important because it's one of those hadith, for some reason, in the last 200 years is completely misunderstood by a lot of people. So the Prophet, and the reason I translated it that way is to indicate the meaning of the hadith. The Prophet ﷺ said that Allah had cursed the Jews and the Christians before us because they had taken the graves of their prophets as places of prostration. And the word that the Prophet used is masajid. Now, why do I translate it like that and not say they took the graves of their prophets as mosques? Because the word masjid in the Arabic language literally means place of prostration. Like mat'am is the place where there is food. Masjid is the place of sujood. So when we call this structure around us a mosque, a masjid, we're using a type of rhetorical use of the word because the main purpose of this place is we make sujood as we pray. So the Prophet ﷺ is saying, don't take my grave and after I die and I'm buried and come and make sujood on top of it. That's what he's saying, not don't build a mosque around me, or don't, because there's a massive mosque around the grave of the Prophet ﷺ. And throughout Islamic history, all of these famous ulama and awliya, they all have graves and monuments built to them. That's not what he was referring to. He was saying, do not come and make sujood on my grave. He also, in these last 5 days, he says something else. He says, a man has been asked to choose between this world and the hereafter, and he chooses the hereafter. So he's very clear that this is the end. But none of the Sahaba get it except Sayyidina Abu Bakr. When Sayyidina Abu Bakr hears this, he starts crying because he understands that this is the end. Meaning that Allah Ta'ala had sent the angels to ask the Prophet ﷺ, do you want to remain or do you want to be with us? And he chose Ar-Rafiq al-A'la. And as a matter of fact, the word Ar-Rafiq al-A'la, these were the last words out of the mouth of the Prophet ﷺ. In the last 4 days, there was another incident in which the Prophet ﷺ is lying down. He's really now it's incapacitated, very difficult to move, and he's just sort of lying down, heavy fever. His wife is trying to take care of him. So he says to the companions, why don't you bring me a scribe, and I will dictate for you some instructions so you won't be misguided after me. And then some of the Sahaba quarrel about this. And Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu, he doesn't want to disturb the Prophet. So when the Prophet sees that the companions are kind of, not fighting, but there's a little bit of commotion, he says, okay, forget it, we're not going to do that. The reason I bring this up, other than the fact that it's part of the Sirah, is that this is one of the issues that divides the Sunnis and the Shias. So some of the Shia interpretations, they take this incident of what I just stated to criticize Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu, to show us that Sayyidina Umar, he messed that up. Had the Prophet ﷺ written this secret document, everything would have been fine. But we know, and forgive me, but I know I don't usually do this, but that's a ridiculous statement, because part of our belief is that the Prophet ﷺ, he was obliged to give us the message in its entirety. So it's not like people were fighting and the Prophet ﷺ was too tired, so he didn't deliver the message and somehow something is missing. I mean, that doesn't make sense. Because if we open that door, then we can open up the door for anything to be missing. But the ulama of the Sunnah, who talked about this specific incident, they said, actually, if you look at all of the hadith of these last few days of the Prophet's life, ﷺ, he did say the things that he wanted to say. And his final instructions were really lumped into two categories. The first category is that the Prophet ﷺ reminded everyone of the importance of prayer, as-salat. It's as simple as that. And elsewhere, the Prophet ﷺ, he said, "La khayra fi dini la salata fi." There is no good in a religious tradition that does not have prayer. So prayer is a cornerstone of any religious faith. The mechanical prayer, not prayer like dua prayer. Prayer here meaning the mechanical prayer, the liturgy. In our case, the Fajr, the Dhuhr, the Asr, the Maghrib, and the Isha. That this is the cornerstone of Islam. So much so that many of the ulama say that if somebody stops praying, that takes them outside of Islam altogether. So the prayer is so important. So here the Prophet ﷺ is reminding them, I'm going to go, but don't get lazy. Don't just stop. You have to keep prayer, prayer, prayer. And then the second piece of advice was the importance of the mosque as an institution. The importance of the mosque, of course, as a place where prayer is conducted, but also where or equally important, where instruction is given, where we teach, where we learn, where the inheritance of the Prophet ﷺ is distributed. So the ulama of the Sunnah, they say, no, this was from actually Umar's hikmah, his wisdom, that he did not want to disturb the Prophet ﷺ in that particular moment, but whatever the Prophet ﷺ wanted to convey to the companions was conveyed. Because we have all of these hadith about the prayer and the mosque and the community, etc. So I just flag that because that's one of those issues that unfortunately divides the Sunni and the Shia community. Not all the time, but one of them. At this point, the Prophet ﷺ was losing his ability to get up and go out and pray, meaning be the imam of the prayer. So he asked or ordered that Sayyidina Abu Bakr would pray, would lead the prayer. And then Sayyidina Aisha, she told him, maybe that's not a good idea because maybe people will take that as a negative sign because Sayyidina Abu Bakr, he had a low, like a soft voice. He was soft spoken most of the time. But Sayyidina Umar was the opposite. You could hear him from a mile away. So he said, why don't we ask Umar? So he got upset with that statement. He said, this is not an area where you need to insert yourself. Please send Abu Bakr. Muru Abu Bakr and yusalli bin nas. I command and I order Abu Bakr to lead the prayer. And at the death of the Prophet, at the passing of the Prophet ﷺ, and the stance that Sayyidina Abu Bakr makes, we see the hikmah in the Prophet ﷺ choosing Abu Bakr to do that. It's not about who's soft-spoken and who's loud. It's about who is firm. Sayyidina Abu Bakr was the sahib, was the companion in the cave. He went through thick and thin with the Prophet ﷺ. Not that we respect all of the Sahaba, but there's a wisdom why the Prophet ﷺ asked Sayyidina Abu Bakr to do that. In the final 2 days, the Prophet ﷺ, he felt a little bit better. At the very end of a sickness, sometimes you get like a second wind to the point that people think, oh, you're better. So he feels better, so he goes out while they are praying. And then the companions, they realize that the Prophet ﷺ has emerged. And they're trying to indicate to Sayyidina Abu Bakr that the Prophet has come. So Sayyidina Abu Bakr steps back, motions for him to stay, but he refused that and he prayed behind the motions of the Prophet ﷺ, meaning that he disobeyed the Prophet out of respect for the Prophet ﷺ. And this concept exists in the Sharia. In other circumstances, like when they were writing the Treaty of Al-Hudaybiyah, and Imam Ali was the scribe, and the Prophet ﷺ said, write Muhammad, this is from Muhammad Rasulullah, And then Suhail said, no, we don't acknowledge that you are Rasulullah. Just write Muhammad, the son of Abdullah. So the Prophet ﷺ told Imam Ali, erase it. And he said, Wallahi, I will never erase it. So he disobeyed the Prophet ﷺ, but out of respect, because that's, you are Rasulullah, why would I erase that? So the Prophet ﷺ said, show me where it is and I'll erase it myself. So this type of, incident occurs. And this is, from a fiqh point of view, one of the reasons why we add Sayyiduna Muhammad in the prayer, for example, like in the tahiyyat at the end of prayer, in the Salat al-Ibrahimiyya, the hadith that is narrated to us is Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad kama sallaita ala Ibrahim wa ali Ibrahim. But traditionally we say Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ali Sayyidina Muhammad kama sallaita ala Sayyidina Ibrahim wa ali Sayyidina Ibrahim, out of respect for the Prophet ﷺ and Abraham alayhi salam. So this was one of those incidents. In the final days of the Prophet's life, ﷺ, he freed any slaves that were in his ownership. He donated the last amounts of wealth that he had, any money, any cash money he had donated it. And he gifted all of his weapons to his companions. So the Prophet ﷺ left this earth with nothing. He gave everything away. This was the real giving pledge. Right? The Prophet ﷺ literally left with nothing. Not that he left a big foundation with his name and he parked all of the money away. No, he literally gave all of his money away. That there was no earthly, wealth left for the Prophet ﷺ. On the final day of the Prophet's life, he saw that there was like not a door but a curtain dividing the Prophet's house to the main part of the mosque. So the Prophet ﷺ, he moved the curtain and he saw the companions praying the Fajr prayer, and he was happy and he smiled, to the point that the companions there was like a fitna in the prayer. They almost lost their prayer because they saw the Prophet, so they wanted to leave the prayer and go, hug him and make sure he was okay. This is the love that existed between the companions and the Prophet ﷺ. On this final day, he asked for his daughter, Lady Fatima, to be sent to him. And this is the famous story when he whispered to her, and then she cried, and then he whispered some more, and then she laughed. So later, after the passing of the Prophet ﷺ, months later, Sayyidah Aisha, she said, I asked Fatima, what was that about? And she said, he told me that I'm going to die, momentarily in a day. And I cried, but then he told me you will be the first of my family to join me, so I laughed. And about 6 months later, Lady Fatima, she also passed as well. So that's where that story takes place. By this time, the Prophet ﷺ had lost his ability to project his voice. So his, final moments we're talking about, his head is in the lap of his wife. So picture this very intimate scene in which the Prophet ﷺ's head is in the lap of his wife Aisha, and he can just barely whisper from the heaviness of the fever, of the sickness. And he sees a companion is walking by with the miswak, and she noticed that he wanted the miswak. So he told her to bring it to him, but it was too hard. It was too weak now at this point. It was too hard. The miswak it's not wet. It's very dry and hard. So she took the miswak and she softened it for him, and then she put it in his mouth. And when we read this part of the Sirah, we say the last thing to enter the mouth of the Prophet ﷺ was the saliva of his wife. I mean, they're very intimate details and very telling of who the Prophet ﷺ was and the relationship he had between him and his wives, him and his companions. There's a very, we read literature and romance and love all the time, but when I read this story, I've never read anything like this. No description I've ever read can top this scene. This is the final scene. This is the final scene of the Prophet's life, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then, as I said, the last thing he said, "Ar-Rafiq al-A'la, Ar-Rafiq al-A'la, Ar-Rafiq al-A'la," the highest level of paradise, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So he passed after Fajr prayer on Monday, the 12th of Rabi' al-Awwal, in in the 11th year of the Hijrah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Now this was a big moment for the companions because nothing like this had ever happened before. I mean, he'd received revelation, he'd gone off to battle, other companions have gone off to battle. You know, there have been sieges, there have been fights, there was the Hijrah, there was a lot of stuff, but nothing like this. He's not coming back from this. So in the beginning, there's this opportunity where a lot of chaos can ensue. So the first issue was, what do we do? Where do we wash him? How do we wash him? Where do we bury him? How do we bury him? You know, you could start to lose your senses with the intenseness of that moment. And Sayyidina Abu Bakr, this is where he shines, and this is where he comes, and he's very even keel about it. He says, no, the Prophet, I heard him, he said that the Anbiya are buried where they died. The problem solved. This is wherever he passed, this is where he's going to be buried. So they wash him in his clothes 3 times, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And in the Sharia, we have 2 main ways that we can bury people. The way that the Prophet ﷺ is buried is called a laht, which you dig down and then to the side. And then when you go into the side, that's where the body is placed. And the other way is just straight down, a shaq, which is the way we bury in this country, for example, is just straight down. The Prophet ﷺ was buried as a laht grave. And from the moment the Prophet ﷺ was washed, the body laid to rest so that the people of Medina can come and pay their respects and pray janazah. And they all entered into the room, the house of the Prophet ﷺ, 10 by 10. And each 10 would come in and they would individually pray the janazah and then they would leave. And another 10 would come in and they would pray the janazah and they would leave. And this took place for 3 days non-stop. Every hour of every day for 3 days. First the men and then the women, and first the family and then the men and then the women and the children, etc. Until everybody in Medina, who was in Medina at that time, had paid their respects and prayed their janazah on the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, until finally he was buried in his grave, in his home, where his body remains until today, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now, when we talk about this, it's important to remember that out of respect for the Prophet, peace be upon him, we do not say that the Prophet ﷺ died, but rather we say he had passed to a Rafiq al-A'la. And the reason we say that is because one of our points of belief is that the Anbiya are alive in their graves, because this is what the Prophet ﷺ himself informed us of, and he said that the graves, Allah has forbidden the graves to decompose the bodies of the Prophets, and that they are alive in their graves. And all of the other hadith about the Prophet ﷺ said, when you say salam to me, I respond to you. And the hadith of Abd al-A'mal, your actions are shown to me. If I find good, I praise Allah. If I find bad, I seek forgiveness on your behalf. All of these hadith the Prophet ﷺ talking about post his human life. So out of respect, we don't say that he died like that. I mean, yeah, he died, of course. You could say wafat al-Nabi, the death of the Prophet, but that's not what we're talking about. We're saying that he passed to a Rafiq al-A'la. You might say, what's the big deal? Why are you being like that? Well, because if you understand what we just said, and all of these are Sahih Hadith, if you understand that, then you will understand the longing that the community has, the longing that the Muslims have for the Prophet ﷺ. But if you keep saying, oh, the Prophet's dead, the Prophet's dead, the Prophet's dead, you're just a few steps away from saying, what benefit is the Prophet ﷺ for us now? And the whole point of all of these lectures, and all of these lectures really are nothing more than a sketch of the Sirah. We didn't really get into the details. I mean, there are some details we talked about, but the point of these lectures was to give a chronological story, a narrative of what happened, play by play as best as we can. But all of these things require contemplation. All of these stories require reflection. All of these incidences need to be tied together so we can really make meaning of this for us now. But if you walk around and say, oh, he's dead, he's dead, he's dead, you know, what's the big deal? You know, he's a man, I'm a man, he's a person in the past, and you start thinking like that, not only do you lose respect for the Prophet, which is, you know, you do that at your own mortal, your own harm for your own soul, but it's just incorrect. because the Prophet ﷺ is alive in his grave. He hears when we call his name. He responds to us when we say alayka salam, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. He intercedes on our behalf with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for our sins. So therefore the Prophet ﷺ is a big deal. Was, is, and will continue to be. So when we come to this part of the seerah, our teachers always reminded us not to say that the Prophet ﷺ is dead or that he died, to speak like that as like Uncle Joe died, but rather that he passed to a Rafiq al-A'la. Sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. What do we do next with all of what we've talked about? So I want to give maybe 3 points of advice for myself and for you. The first is that the seerah really requires a lot of reflection and connecting the dots. If you look at the micro stories of the seerah, sometimes you read them in another book, it's important to remember where in the seerah did that incident happen. And that's what these lectures were set up to do, to give you a framework that you can plug in. You have two broad things. You have Mecca and Medina. So there you go. That's two broad categories right there. And then if you remember the main battles, you have before Badr, after Badr, before Uhud, after Uhud, before the ditch, after the ditch, so on and so forth. Before the Risala, the first 40 years of the Prophet's life. So you have these broad periods of time. So when you read a hadith, you read a story, you ask, I wonder, when did this take place? What is the context in which this story happened? So you need to reflect on what you read, and you need to plug it into this timeline, this very broad, simple timeline, to understand what happened when. Because all of the Prophet's life is guidance for us. Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Even the time before he was commissioned as a prophet is guidance for us. Even the stories from when he was a child were guidance from us. Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So we need to reflect and connect the dots. And you would be surprised about how familiar stories from the life of the Prophet are to our current condition. You would be almost shocked. Some of them, you would think that someone's playing a joke on us. It's like verbatim, it's the same. It's so interesting how similar what they went through and what we were going through in different parts of the community, in different parts of the seerah. So that's the first thing, is you need to reflect, connect the dots. The second is, I encourage all of us to read more in the literature about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So in the very beginning, we talked about what is a literature that relates to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It's not just the seerah. The seerah are the life events. It's like the biography. But we talked about the shama'il. We talked about the characteristics of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And Imam at-Tirmidhi's book, Ash-Shama'il, has recently been translated into English, called A Portrait of the Prophet, I believe. It's available by Fons Vitae. That's a great book in which you get to see how the Prophet ﷺ looked, smelled, how he ate, how he lived, the physical attributes of the Prophet ﷺ. So the Shama'il is one category. The Khasa'is, his special attributes, is another category. Then there are the auxiliary things, the works that talk about the family of the Prophet ﷺ, the works that talk about the tools of the Prophet, the government of the Prophet, the armies of the Prophet, the riding animals of the Prophet. You find all of these books in all sorts of languages that talk about different aspects related to the Prophet. And there is no end to how much you can do in that. The more you do, the more you read, the more you encompass yourself with the Prophet, all of the aspects of the Prophet's life, the more real he will be for you. And you will understand the obsession that the Muslims have with loving and praising the Prophet. So my advice in number 2 is to further your research, further your reading, and come back to these lectures as a simple guide so you understand the map of what's happening where. And then the last thing I want to say in conclusion is that I encourage all of us to have a daily routine of salawat on the Prophet. And this is something that is very easy. It doesn't cost anything. It doesn't take any effort, but it adds a lot of mileage in your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and your relationship to the Prophet. Whatever formula you're attracted to, whatever formula of salawat you feel inclined towards. Some people, they like things like Dala'il al-Khairat, which is a very famous collection of salawat. there's Basha'ir al-Khairat of Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, there's Kunuz al-Asrar, the famous Tunisian, and Harushi. There are all of these different books, manuals of durood, of prayers on the Prophet ﷺ. Whether you read from those books or whether you have your own, routine, you have to dedicate part of your spiritual and devotional life to sending prayers on the Prophet ﷺ. And I come back to highlight this to my favorite characters, Majnoon and Layla. What makes Majnoon Majnoon? What makes Majnoon crazy is all he can think about is Layla. Everything he sees Layla because he's in love with Layla. He sees the trees, he sees the camel, he sees the sand, he sees the moon, he sees the stars. Everything he sees is Layla because he's in love. If you are in love with the Prophet ﷺ, then this will manifest in how you speak about him. It will manifest in how you talk about him. It will manifest in how you think about him. So how can you be in love with somebody and never mention them at all? How could you be in love with somebody and never think about them at all? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. But the people that are really in love and excited about something, they always talk about it. When somebody has a new idea, they keep talking about it. Or when our kids are, there's a new fad, all they're talking about is that one thing. They won't stop talking about that one thing. So our salawat on the Prophet ﷺ daily is our way of doing that. It's our way of expressing our love. And it is our way of solidifying everything that we're talking about. Everything that we've read, everything that we understood, everything that we've discussed is summarized in those formulas of prayer on the Prophet ﷺ because there is no end to how much we can praise him. Imam al-Busiri says in the Burda, the greatness of the Prophet ﷺ has no limit. There is no limit to his greatness that human speech can encompass. I mean, you can say whatever you want about the Prophet ﷺ, he's going to be greater than what you think. That's what he's saying. So if somebody is that great, is that awesome, is that important, how could you not pass a day except of thinking of him? And I close with the famous statement of the famous Moroccan Sufi who was buried in Alexandria, Egypt, Al-Mursi Abu al-Abbas, radiyallahu anhum, and he said, لو غاب عني رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم ما عددت نفسي من المسلمين. Were the Prophet ﷺ to vanish from my sight, from my consciousness for a moment, I would not consider myself amongst the Muslims. So this is the role that the Prophet ﷺ should play in our daily spiritual life. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless us, to make us closer to the remembrance of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Wallahu ta'ala a'lam. Any questions?
Who said the last quote?
Al-Mursi Abu al-Abbas. He's the Khalifa of Abu Hassan al-Shadili.
What's the earliest sources of the Prophet's biography? I mean, is it the Tabari, or Ibn Jabbar?
Ibn Ishaq. Ibn Ishaq is the literature of the Sirah goes back to Ibn Ishaq. As for the manuscript of Ibn Ishaq, that doesn't exist. We don't have that. All we have are the manuscripts of Ibn Hisham. So Ibn Hisham took the manuscript or the writings of Ibn Ishaq, because Ibn Ishaq was tasked with writing a ginormous history from the beginning of time until whatever the Khalifa was at that time. I can't remember. So Ibn Hisham said, okay, let's just take the Sirah and let's add to it. So the main Sirah document, when we talk about the genre of Sirah, all of the Sirahs go back to Ibn Hisham as a genre of literature. But remember that the Sirah is nothing more than the lumping together of different hadith in a chronology. So the hadith themselves, they go back to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So for example, Ibn Hisham, he will have a sketch of the chronology. So like the Battle of Badr. Battle of Badr, that's the chapter heading. And then he'll bring all of the hadith narrated related to the Battle of Badr, but he organizes the hadith chronologically. That's what the Sirah is.
What's the authenticity of the original 200 years before the Prophet's death, all the deeds and everything? So is there some error of mistake or something, or we don't have a written record of that time, that nobody It's like story that the time was.
The hadith was written during the life of the Prophet ﷺ. It was not written 200 years later. The Quran and the hadith were written while the Prophet ﷺ was alive. The earliest collection of hadith was called As-Sahifa As-Sadiqa, the honest document. And they were written on parchments and papers and things like that. Where are those early collections of hadith? All of those are inside the Musnad of Imam Ahmad. So Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal radiallahu anhu, when he compiled the hadith, his Musnad is a biographical hadith. He starts alphabetically with all of the Sahaba, Sayyidina Abu Bakr. So he puts all of the hadith that Sayyidina Abu Bakr narrates. Umar, all of the hadith that Umar, so on and so forth, all the way till the end. All of those early, like Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhu, the son of Umar ibn Khattab, he wrote the hadith. All of those documents of hadith are subsumed in the larger canon that comes later. So the only thing that comes later is the canon, Bukhari, Muslim, etc. But it's not like the hadith, everyone forgot the hadith until Bukhari woke up and said, oh, we need to write the hadith. That's not true. The hadith and the Quran were written at the time of the Prophet, the life of the Prophet ﷺ.
And how was the Al-Muwatta categorized?
Fiqh. So Imam Malik, radiallahu anhu, the Muwatta is the fiqh, the hadith dalil for the madhab of Imam Malik, which is why he refused to standardize it. So when Harun al-Rashidi came and told him, I want to make this standard in all Muslims, they got to follow the one, he said, no, because this is ijtihad.
And
that's in my thesis, that section. That's why I highlighted for you, because that's important, because some people, they misunderstand that episode.
And Balaturi's Futuh al-Buldan.
Who?
Balaturi.
Yeah?
Is his book on the origins of nations. He used it as the Sirah, the study of Sirah.
I don't know. It's like early history. But I think that's after Ibn Hisham.
I think in Gregorian dates, I think 806.
Yeah, no, Ibn Ishaq was much earlier than that. But everybody wrote Sirah. Ibn Kathir in the Bidayah wa Nihaya, Tabari, in Tarikh al-Kabir, all of these ulama wrote aspects of the Sirah. But the genre, that's why I call it the genre, like Usul al-Fiqh. Where does Usul al-Fiqh come from? We say the first to write about Usul al-Fiqh was Imam al-Shafi'i. It's not like he made it up and no one knew about Usul al-Fiqh, and Imam Malik and Imam Abu Hanifa didn't know about Usul al-Fiqh. Of course they have Usul. Everything goes back to the Prophet ﷺ with a direct chain. But the genre of the writing of the Sirah, it comes from Ibn Ishaq. Even in our asanid, in our chains, in our ijazas, the ijazah goes back to the Sirah of Ibn Hisham. Have no doubt. Okay? Don't doubt the sources. Really don't doubt the sources. When people say the hadith is false, say salama. That's it. And it will go away. We're going to make these t-shirts. Salama, bruv.
Clarification. Say that the hadith is transmitted orally, and what they're saying that it was written, so...
Both. The primary mode of transmission in the early generations was oral transmission. But at the same time, both the hadith and the Quran were physically written. So when Sayyidina Abu Bakr, for example, put together the Mus'haf, they brought all the parchments and stuff together. And they made sure that two companions testified to each verse.
But in hadith, we find some slight variations in the narration.
Yes.
In Quran. So, just trying to understand if it was written, then why the differences?
Well, it wasn't all written. It wasn't all written. But yes, there are variations because maybe the narrator heard this or the narrator heard that. So, and this brings up a very important issue. Our burden of proof begins with the chain of transmission, not what is being transmitted. So in the early, like let's say in the early, 2-3 generations, what matters before I hear what you're going to say is who you heard that from and who he heard that from, back to the Prophet. If all of you are people that are, upright, then whatever you say is gold for me. That's the way the Muslims verified information. In the Western world or in the modern world, it's the opposite. If you say something and I don't like what you say, I don't care who. That's the attitude that we have. But the attitude of the early Muslims was the opposite. You're like, oh, you heard this from Abdullah bin Umar? Oh, you heard this from Nafi'? Oh, this is gold. They would never lie like that. But there are weaker chains of transmission for the hadith, of course, but not for the Quran. Anybody else?
So, like I just asked a question about the Shia say that they're, Hazrat Ali should have been the appointed, and there's controversy there. So where does that come from? That they said they come up with this, that the whole, part of Islam is Islam, which say that at the death of the Prophet there was some inclination that Hazrat Ali, is that true, or that there was some, or they did some hadith?
No, they because of all of the hadith praising Imam Ali, which are all hadith that we uphold as well. So they say that he is more of a right to be the Khalifa than Sayyidina Abu Bakr. Our understanding of political succession is different, however. When we say that no Sunni Muslim disagrees with the succession of Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, Ali, Hassan, the first 5 caliphs. There are no discrepancies in Sunni Islam whatsoever. But that doesn't mean that that's necessarily the order of greatness, for example, even though that is the Sunni position. In other words, the Sunni ulama can differentiate. Just because Sayyidina Abu Bakr was the first Khalifa doesn't mean that Imam Ali is not Imam Ali. The Shias, they put all that together. Well, if Imam Ali is so great, if the Prophet ﷺ said this about him, this about him, this about him, which are hadith that we uphold as well, why is he not the first Khalifa? So this is an issue called an afdaliyya. Who is afdal? Who is better? Who has more of a right? So for us, political succession doesn't necessarily mean that that person is better in all aspects. Maybe Imam Ali was more knowledgeable. But what does that have to do with who's going to lead? Look what happened. If Sayyidina Abu Bakr didn't stand and say, no, you bury him here. After the Prophet ﷺ passed away, Sayyidina Umar was going to go crazy. He went for revelation. He's coming back. He took out his sword. He said, whoever says the Prophet is dead, I'm going to kill him. So Abu Bakr went out in front of him. And he said, this is not true. The Prophet ﷺ has passed. Whoever worships Muhammad has passed. But whoever worships Allah hayyun la yamut. When he said that, Sayyidina Abu Bakr fell, Sayyidina Umar fell. The sword fell out of his hand. He fell down to the ground crying. That's why Sayyidina Abu Bakr was the first Khalifa, because that was the stand. He needed to have that stance. That's it. That's all it means. It doesn't mean that we don't like Sayyidina Ali and things like that. So, we're never going to solve this problem. I mean, it's just, either you're a Sunni or you're a Shia. So you just got to pick which one makes sense. I mean, honestly, we can talk till the cows come home. It doesn't make a difference. But our love for Imam Ali and for Ahlul Bayt is is second to none. I mean, we love Imam Ali. Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, he wrote a book, Fada'il al-Sahaba, the attributes of the Sahaba. 2/3 of the book are all hadith praising Imam Ali. The last third of the book are hadith praising all of the rest of the Sahaba. So we have no problem with our love of Imam Ali and our respect for Imam Ali and Ahlul Bayt. حب أهل البيت فرض علينا. It's an obligation that we love the family of the Prophet ﷺ. يا آل رسول الله حبكم يا آل بيت رسول الله حبكم فرض في القرآن أنزله يكفيكم من عظيم الفخر أنكم من لم يصلي عليكم لا صلاة له. O family of the Prophet, your love is something that is obligatory on us. It has been revealed in the Quran. It is enough of praise of you that whoever does not say salawat on you, their prayer is not valid. Meaning that when you do the salat, the tahiyyat, you have to say Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ali Sayyidina Muhammad. I think these are the lines of Imam Shafi'i, if I'm not mistaken. As a matter of fact, Imam Shafi'i was accused of being Shia because of his love of Ahlul Bayt. Yeah, but the Sunni Shia thing we're not going to solve, so we just need to coexist. Just need to coexist and respect each other. Anybody else? How's everything in your neck of the woods? Good? School's good? Remember, salama. That's the secret word. Anybody on campus says it? Salama. Salama, man, what's up? Hashtag salama. Anybody else?
Could you say a bit about after the Prophet passed, the transition that took place? It's a long story, but in a nutshell, it would be nice for us to know what the events were in the weeks of his passing.
Well, after the Prophet ﷺ is buried and, those 3 days, 3-4 days of the washing and the janazah and then the actual burial, the leaders of the Sahaba, or the Sahaba, like with a capital S, like the Sahaba of stature, they all agree, including Imam Ali, which one of the things I don't understand how people miss that, agree that Sayyidina Abu Bakr will be the Khalifa, will be the leader. So, it's just as simple as that. I mean, there's no pomp or circumstance, he is the leader. And immediately there are troubles, because as news of the Prophet's passing spread, many of the tribes that had just become Muslim now want to leave Islam, they don't want to pay their zakah. So for the 2 years that Sayyidina Abu Bakr is the Khalifa, he's occupied with the Ridda wars. And basically establishing law and order in Arabia. So it was very quick and very busy. He was only the Khalifa for 2 years, I believe. So there was really not that much time to do much else. But his main contribution is one, he helped the transition in the immediate aftermath by providing sanity to the community, so no one loses it. Well, that's what we talked about. Number 2 is the Ridda Wars, where he establishes, this is not a joke, this is serious. You became Muslim, you're part of the state, that's a serious situation. And zakat is part of Islam. You can't not pay zakat. And then number 3 was he was the first to compile the Mus'haf. He was the first to bring this idea to the companions that there was a need to preserve the Quran in written form. But he was only 2 years, and he died naturally, of course.
Okay.
Last year, I think I was going to a gathering. It was bringing up on his hair. Probably majority of the rest of you talked about it. I'm not keeping late. I was late. But I was telling
the party doesn't start until you go.
Oh, thank you. So no, I was going. I was telling my friends, I'm going to go see the Prophet's hair. Like, what? It exists? How did it exist? What is it? This is wrong. Why would you go? Why is it such a big thing to just look at a hair? I'm like, I don't know how to answer the question. I'm like, it is Prophet's hair. There's no authenticity behind it. So it was a debate in regards to that, right? So and I think every year in Virginia they have the Mawlid and stuff they bring the hair of the Prophet, which is so I think it's a big thing. But those people are what's wrong? What are you doing? Why you guys going gathering around a piece of hair? So that was something that was.
So there are artifacts. There are many artifacts attributed to the Prophet ﷺ. Pieces of his clothing, his hair, his tools, staff, sword, footprints throughout the Muslim world. Some of them we have direct chain of transmission that we know that this is authentic because we can trace back to the companion who had it. And some things are not. Some things you just take it on faith. So it doesn't add or subtract. I mean, I believe that this is, somebody gave this to me. I believe this is a hair from the beard of the Prophet ﷺ. I'm going to believe it. I want to believe it. I'm going to be very biased, and I don't care about verify. I'm very happy to have that and to keep that. And the Sahaba themselves, they sought the blessings from the artifacts of the Prophet ﷺ while he was alive and after he passed. When we talked about that throughout the Sirah, Khalid ibn Walid, he had the hair of the Prophet ﷺ, he put it inside his cap when he was in battle. He said, I never lost battle as long as the hair was in my cap. Meaning while the Prophet ﷺ was alive and after the Prophet ﷺ passed. The staff of the Prophet ﷺ was passed from Khalifa to Khalifa. The burda of the Prophet ﷺ, Muawiyah, the burda that the Prophet ﷺ gave to Ka'b ibn Zuhair, Muawiyah wanted to buy it for like 50,000 dinar, like something ludicrous, like, we're talking about like $50 million, something ludicrous like that. So these are companions. And tabi'een that did all of these things. So there's nothing wrong with, why wouldn't you be happy with an artifact of the Prophet's life, Prophet ﷺ? So that's where it comes from. So whether, either you get it or you don't. Either you get it or you don't. Yeah. I was.
The fact that you said that Prophet Muhammad's body was kept for 3 days for people coming in, offering respects, as well as doing the janazah. Is that part of Sunnah? Or are we allowed to do that? The other thing is that when a person dies, if he's in another country away from home, is he supposed to be buried in that country, or some people tend to take it back to their home country?
Of course, some of the things of the Prophet's washing and burial were unique to the Prophet ﷺ. So when Sayyidina Abu Bakr came at the moment of the Prophet's passing, he realized that he had passed, and he kissed him, and he said, Tibta hayyan wa mayyita. You are beautiful in your life and in your death. And so the Prophet's body is not going to decompose, it's not going to smell, and everyone wants to pay their respects to the Prophet. They want to see him one last time. So that's very different than if one of us dies. So that's why the janazah of the Prophet took place that way. But that's going to only be for the Prophet. Very rare, like something like that would happen for somebody else. But it does happen. So Imam al-Shafi'i, when he died, they prayed janazah on him twice. So he had written, if I die, or when I die, take me to Sayyidah Nafisa and let her pray janazah on me. One of the granddaughters of the Prophet ﷺ, who was living in Egypt. So they took his body to her home, and then she prayed janazah on him, and then they took his body to the mosque, and then they prayed the collective janazah. So for people of that stature, sometimes that happens. As for the sunnah is that you are buried, you are washed and buried as quickly as possible where you die. So if somebody dies away from home, the sunnah would be to be washed and buried in the place where you die, acknowledging that that's what Allah wanted. I mean, if Allah wanted me to die in Pakistan, I would have died in Pakistan. But if I die in Sierra Leone, then I die in Sierra, that's where Allah wrote. So I might as well be buried there. But it's not haram for people to take the body, because sometimes people, they die away from a Muslim community. And they're all alone, and now there are like diplomatic issues involved, so the body has to be returned to the country of origin because they were on a visa. So in situations like that, the Sharia is forgiving. That's okay. You can embalm the body and then travel.
But to wait for a relative to come, like a child who's abroad, and they want to see their parents before burial and stuff like that, they shouldn't wait. They just should go ahead.
Yeah, the sunnah is to wash and bury right away. And remember that, I want to wait till my son comes to see me one last time. That's for the living. Our obligation is for the deceased. So remember, the person has died. So what do we do with this person that has died? We need to wash them and bury them as quickly as possible. All that other stuff is for us, the living. We're the ones that mourn. We're the ones that feel. That's all emotions. And the emotions are real. I'm not negating the emotions, but I'm saying is that the obligation we have is to honor, the ikram that Allah, the nobility that Allah has given the human being necessitates for us that we wash, shroud, and pray janazah and bury the body as quickly as possible.
And women are praying janazah. In our countries, they're not allowed to do that.
Like the janazah prayer?
Janazah prayer.
No, men and women pray janazah prayer. It has nothing to do.
Here they do Pakistan or India. I've never seen anybody women because they make such a big screaming and stuff like that. But people who don't even do that, there's still no trend or anything that.
Yeah, well, the janazah happens in the mosque. The prayer happens in the mosque. Whoever's ever in the mosque prays the janazah prayer.
Like in the Kaaba in Medina, whenever there's janazah, they pray. The women pray.
Yeah, the only issue of men and women is in washing the body.
Okay. Yeah, that's what's
Men wash men, women wash women. That's the majority of opinion that the spouses do not wash one another. However, Imam Ali washed Sayyidah Fatima. So that's a unique opinion. But the fiqh of the majority of the schools is that the spouses do not wash one another. That if a man dies, men will wash him. If a woman dies, the women wash him. Which is why both men and women need to learn how to wash and shroud a body and all of that. But as for the janazah prayer, the more people that pray the janazah, the better for the deceased. Men, women, it doesn't matter. It's not like Jummah prayer where it's an issue of men only. No, it doesn't matter. Nothing prevents women from praying. Nothing prevents women from going to the graves and visiting the graves at all. Of course, with decorum, but I mean, that would go even for men.
She's saying that in India, Pakistan, you don't go to the janazah prayer.
There's no room for the women. They don't let them go to the mosque.
No, go to the masjid.
In Bangladesh also, they don't allow.
In Bangladesh, go to the mosque. And tell them I sent you. Go to the mosque and pray the janazah. And revive the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu.
I mean, you have to worry about tensions too between different groups and stuff. Like the Deobandis will fight with the Ravis and they'll fight with the other people. So.
Yeah, just wear ICCP banners. Yeah, I'm neither. I'm ICCP. That's fine.
If they pray at home, even janazah before the janazah.
Yes, you can pray janazah anywhere. So you can pray the absent janazah. That's another way around it. So maybe the women can get together. Just say we're going to have like a concert and you rent the hall. No one's going to have a problem with that. But then you all make janazah. Like one time, Sheikh Nazim, rahimahullah, wanted to buy a mosque in London. And I think it was like a church or something. And right, you correct me if I'm wrong. And then they said they didn't want to sell it to the Muslims. He's like, oh no, we're going to have like a dance and exercise group. So they sold him the church. And then they saw the prayer, like, this is our dance and exercise. Prayer and our dhikr. The Prophet ﷺ said the Muslim is kayyis fatin. He is smart and slick. So we have to be smart and slick. All the women of Medina prayed the janazah on the Prophet ﷺ.
I was reading about the story of Bilal alayhi salam asking the Prophet, how,
He left.
Yeah, he left.
He said, I can't live here anymore.
How long was that period?
For a long time, he moved to Damascus. He said, I can't. No more adhan. I said, I can't say the adhan because every time I would say, Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah, I would see the face of the Prophet. He's like Majnun and Layla, that everything in Medina reminds me of the Prophet. So he left, he went to Damascus. And then he came one time to visit Medina. So the companions in Medina, they said, Bilal, give us the adhan the way you gave the adhan at the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So he said, okay. So he started to say the adhan, and when he got to Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah, he started crying. He said, I couldn't finish it. And that's why Sayyidina Imam Bilal is buried in Damascus. He's buried in Damascus.
It's time for Isha.
Okay.
But before we conclude, it's been almost a year that we've had the Sirah series. And during Ramadan, we feel very sad when Ramadan ends. Likewise, in me, I feel a certain sadness that we have brought the Sirah session to an end. I want to say that for us, many of us do not read as much as we should. And Brother Tarek has done the needful for us. We are the cliff notes of Sirah. He summarized it for us so well, in such depth, in such breadth, that he brought it to us in ICCP, and unfailingly, we were able to assimilate the key elements of the Sirah. Those who were here, there were many who have not missed one Sirah session. Many of us who travel, we tune in to the audio recordings or to the YouTube sessions, and we are connected. And I must say that I speak for everybody who is here, that this has been an extremely useful, a blessed session of Sirah, that very rarely do we have people of such erudition able to communicate a very complex life, which is so varied, so different, and so relevant that in such a simple manner that all of us can understand, that all of us can practice, and be reminded that we should continue to observe the Sunnah of the Prophet. In doing so, Brother Tariq has done a tremendous service to us, and I ask you to raise your hands and ask dua for him and his family, that he be blessed, his parents be blessed, and his family be blessed for all the services that he has done during this Sirah time. Today's event, when we brought in the last chapter of the Prophet, was very emotional, and I'm sure that all of us feel that emotion, and with that emotion, in that dua, we ask that Allah accepts our presence here as also our commitment and your family's commitment to the cause that the Prophet left behind for all of us. So thank you very much. May Allah bless all of us.